Bruce, let's get to it. Let's talk
about
Bad Blood 2003. It's a pretty big deal because we're covering this on the exact 15-year anniversary. It goes down in your hometown of Houston, Texas at the old Compaq Center. It drew 10,000 fans for a $500,000 gate, and it was offered for free for the U.S. Armed Forces who were returning home from the Iraq War. Huge success. This is the very second Bad Blood. Of course, the first one took place in 1997, which we've covered before. That, of course, is unfortunately the day Brian Pillman passed away, or when we learned about it. And also the very first ever Hell in a Cell match with Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. Catch that in our archives at somethingtowrestle.com. We don't see another Bad Blood until right here. Who was a proponent of the name Bad Blood?
I think it was just kind of revisiting some old names. Vince went through a transitional period of he wanted everything to be different. He didn't want to repeat anything except for the Big Five. And he wanted the other ones to have different names and have their own identity, if you will, for that specific show. And he didn't want to repeat, like have a Great American Bash every year. That's changed. And then he got into, we should have Bad Blood and Money in the Bank, and those should be annual events. So he kind of waffled back and forth a little bit and came back to Bad Blood in 2003.
Chat me up a little bit about the pricing strategy for pay-per-views here, because the big pay-per-views have always been, or at least in this era, they were $34.99 or $34.95, $35, we'll call it. But before here, like when we did In Your House Bad Blood, the In Your Houses were a reduced pricing strategy. Now, the idea here is, I understand, it's a shorter show. It's a 2-hour show, so it's a smaller price. It feels like when you guys did sort of brand exclusive pay-per-views, somebody may have pitched, well, hey, let's do a 2-hour show when it's just Raw and a 2-hour show when it's just SmackDown for a reduced fee. You don't do that. And of course, I think somebody smartened somebody else up and said, hey, they're going to buy it either way. So let's give them the extra hour and charge the extra 10 or $15, right?
Well, no, because the idea behind the pay-per-view, the television shows, both Raw and SmackDown, were already 2 hours.
Right.
So you had to give them something extra on pay-per-view. And since you were giving them the extra third hour, the price made sense for the normal 3-hour pay-per-views. And that is how Vince looked at it. We had to do more than the 2-hour shows that we were already giving them. When we were doing the In Your Houses, and they were only 2 hours, Raw was only an hour at that time too. So once Raw went to 2 hours and we started doing a lot more, that's what changed a lot of the philosophy on the pay-per-views.
Let's talk a little bit about just the overall feel of the company, because you and I have talked about this a little bit before, where you sort of talked about 2002 compared to 2003. Sort of wrap that up for us. How would you compare 2002 in hindsight to 2003?
Well, really and truly, I think that they kind of ran together, frankly. And 2003 kind of became the year that we wished we would have had, and at least from a talent perspective, in 2000, when we had the invasion and when we actually, WCW went out of business and we purchased WCW. If we had had the Ric Flairs, if we had had the Kevin Nash, if we had Goldberg, Scott Steiner, and all of those guys 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, I think that would have made a big difference in 2000. And it was kind of a year in the fog, if you will. It was a little funky, and everybody that I've talked to about it, going back and trying to just get some help jogging my memory on this show, was like, oh God, you remember this? And it was things that it was a rebuilding time and a tough time for those of us in the company, especially in creative.
Let's talk a little bit about, where business was, because we've talked about 2003 quite a bit. We covered WrestleMania 19 and it had a very disappointing buy rate. 560,000 buys is all they did. I say all they did because WrestleMania 18, the year prior in 02, did 840,000 buys. A lot of people sort of freestyle that maybe that's because they loaded up No Way Out too much, which was where they returned with Steve Austin. Of course, No Way Out in 03 got 450,000 buys. But the February pay-per-view in 02 was the NWO debut, and it got 575,000 buys. So certainly month over month, we're way down here. And Bad Blood, even though we talked about the big pile of money it made, I guess we should mention here, it's a bit of a shock because Foley is coming back here, which we're going to talk about, but the number's up. So Backlash right after WrestleMania, which was a big disappointment, they come back with Goldberg and Rock. They do 345,000 buys, which has to be a disappointment. They come in with Judgment Day 03, 315,000 buys. And then we're way up for Bad Blood 385. Now from the prior year, it still feels like we're down a little bit. But in actuality, we're up because this is replacing King of the Ring 02. So although overall pay-per-view business is down, Bad Blood 03 does really, really well, especially compared to the rest of 2003. Why do you think, and I know we're going to talk about the show in great detail, what was the reason that this show sort of outkicked its coverage, so to speak? It beat expectations.
Well, also you have to understand too, in that time frame, our budget was 300,000. If we hit 300,000, it was a good day on buy rate. So anything over 300,000 was a success. So when you talk about, that's got to be disappointing, no, because we were looking at anything over 300 compared to the previous years. Yes, it was. And business overall was down and felt a little out of sorts. In addition, pay-per-view business and everything encompassing it. But I can't tell you that. I don't think that. Maybe it was the star power. Maybe it was finally bringing in a lot of the guys that were in from WCW, but it just was kind of an anomaly, really.
Let's talk a little bit about the decision to move away from King of the Ring. But before we do, I want you to sort of break down what you said there about 300,000 buys. Let's say, for instance, that a pay-per-view was $34.99. Out of that $34.99, and we've talked about this before, way back in the archives, but I want to touch on it again. Roughly how much, what percentage of that $34.99 would WWE receive?
Roughly 50.
Okay. So now we're down to $17.50, we'll call it. So let's talk about that $17.50 and the way that collection process works. Someone receives their DirecTV or their Comcast bill, they pay it, and that happens roughly 30 days after the ordering. And then, maybe some slapdicks are delinquent because they didn't go to savewithbruce.com and they're slow paying their bill. So maybe it's 60 or 90 days after, that's when the money starts to roll in.
Correct. By the time that the cable companies, DirecTV, Comcast or Xfinity, Time Warner, all those folks, and that's who you're dealing with a lot of times at this point in the game. By the time they would retrieve all of their money, and then they would pay us, and it would be about 90 days after the event before they'd ever receive the money.
So there you go. It winds up being $6.7 million WWE side from the domestic pay-per-view. In 2003, how much international revenue were you guys dragging in?
You didn't have pay-per-view internationally except when we would do a UK pay-per-view specific. All right. For the most part, a lot of those pay-per-views were sold as specials to our television partners internationally. For example, and I don't know this to be fact and or accurate, I'm using it as a hypothetical, India and Star TV, Star Asia may buy WrestleMania as a special. So that would be in addition to the rights fee that they would pay for, say, Raw or SmackDown. Then they would pay for additional specials. Some of them would just buy the big five. Some of them would want the monthly special. So it depended upon what it was. Some areas didn't get all the pay-per-views. So it wasn't a pay-per-view per se, but they did get paid extra for it.